Joining us now, who's in the panel discussion, is Alexander Schwartz, sitting next to me here. I'll introduce him formally in a few minutes. He's the project architect for the Neues Museum in Berlin, and he's agreed to at least sit at the table and possibly comment on some of the things that have been said. I'd like to thank the speakers for 3 very nice presentations, which for me, what would I characterize? I would say in the first 2 you were offered, in the first one I think you were offered a very nice sequence, which if you remember back started with the question of how architects and landscape architects represent conventionally and the kind of armature of a plan, a section and an elevation, and then a sequence of discussions about what that meant for the way you saw what was there, and then how that would perhaps needed to be updated in order to confront certain types of condition which weren't about creating a new object which you could plan or section or elevate, but in which the condition that you're encountering, which Ellen would talk about ruinous landscapes, is probably something which is very difficult to record using that kind of armature. Is Suzanne here? Oh, there you are. Sorry. And then I think you were offered what would I say is a synopsis or an overview of kind of possible strategies in relationship to that. And also in Suzanne's paper, which drew on this tradition of field work and of also being very interested in what kinds of moves architects make, you were also offered a kind of an account of a fantastic book, which gives kind of multiple examples of how these things might play out, the way of looking. And then you kind of got this very enjoyable one-off view from one person who had looked in one way. Is it fair to ask either Ellen or Suzanne just to either contextualize or give a comment to the last paper, which we can all remember?
Yeah, I would like to start. It works? Yeah. Well, I would like to thank you for your presentation, because it really sort of makes your mind work on this issue, because you sort of condense this very complex to one sort of bouillon thing, and you call it the essence. And in terms of creative strategies, I mean, it's a very straightforward and engaging strategy. But one could think of other ways of approaching these areas, because one could think of this complex that you were looking at as a product of time, and thinking of the 2 main types of forces that have been shaping this. There's the authoritative one, which is the intentional one, and then there's the vernacular thing. All these things that have shaped and reshaped over time. And thinking and comparing this place with a person. And we could ask, who is Suzanne? Is she Suzanne at 5 years old, at 10 years old, or when she started studying, or is it now? And you would say, well, she's all of that. She's the accumulation of all the things that have shaped her throughout her lifetime. So that's quite interesting to think of a place as a product of time, as a sort of counter model to thinking of the essence, where you try to sort of boil things down. But having this transformation into something that is material, which is physical, that gives you a new starting point. So I think it's a very sort of productive strategy and very enriching to see it. So as an initial comment.
May I ask a question as well? Because thank you very much. I mean, it's been great to contribute and also dialogue. But I suppose I was thinking, Roger, when you talked about Deserto and walking in the city, and Ellen, obviously in the Daedalus and Icarus, there's a sort of difference in the viewpoint, and I saw a connection there. But I wondered, for both of you, was there something different to walk in the landscape rather than walk in the city? Does that affect how you see, how you behave, the time you spend there, what the constraints are? I just wondered if either of you had a comment on that.
Is it on? Yeah. In this particular case of walking around the regiment, I think the key thing about those two perspectives is, it's the point of Deserto's thing is not just about walking in the city. It's the perspective of being down amongst things, so that it could be, in a small village or in a landscape. Why not? I think that's the key thing to remember, that you need these two perspectives. It's deceitful to think that you understand everything from above. I mean, it's so easy to lose yourself there.
I just wonder, you say the difference between walking a landscape or a city, and I think when you start labeling, I have a toolbox for looking at landscapes, and I have another toolbox when I look at urban areas. And that means that I sort of predefine my way of looking, because I have certain expectations and I project values from the very beginning, and I start looking for those values. And then you only see what you're looking for, so to speak. So I think the real sort of creative challenge is to find a way to ask questions where you can get your eye on something that you were not sort of looking for, right? Because it's easy to find what we know and what we can recognize, but how to make these sort of shortcuts, and that's where you really have to be creative in the way that you ask questions for things. So sometimes it can be extremely productive to take your toolbox for the landscape and use it in the urban area. I mean, just as a way of making shortcuts. And that's, for me, that's really one of the sort of main challenges when it comes to these ruinous industrial landscapes, because it's both and it's also either, none of them. So how do we actually start looking at it? I also think we frame the way we look at things because we are searching for values. Whether we are doing it intentionally or not intentionally. Because we can look for values in what it was. We're thinking of that what we are confronted with was something before, right? And we can look at values for what it is. And especially being a designer, we are very, very good looking for values of what it can become. So, and all of these values, sort of crisscrossing times, is really active when we are out looking at things. So it's an extremely complex thing, and a room for creative thinking.
I would like to ask Alexandra if you have a comment on that from obviously a situation where I know you teach, but I understand that you practice very, very, very much, I would guess. From the position you come from.
That's true. And to be honest, half through the talk of Roger, even if I enjoyed it a lot, I thought, what is this about? And only in the end, I maybe got the point that this is about finding out what this is about. And I think that's a really, really critical question, which is which I think is an absolutely crucial point for designing, that in the beginning you create a tool, or you have a tool which allows you to find out or to raise a question which is appropriate to discover or to show or to air some of the, I don't know, character, mystery, or specificities of a location. I think the world is full of architecture which answers brilliantly architectural questions, but quite often I think the questions which are raised are not particularly appropriate to air, or to show what this is about exactly. I mean,
I also a little bit. Just, I mean, this is kind of curiosity, but the example Roger showed us was kind of permitted by a frame of research. There was a bit of extra money. There wasn't somebody breathing down your neck wanting to know the answer. Within your practice, how do you create that space, or do you create that? Do you need to create that space, or do you have methods that are kind of so already in place that they can just be employed? Because I'm thinking of sort of these. If we go to Ellen's thing of finding a way of finding an answer that you didn't expect in a situation, which also feels to be.
I think for us it's very important to, at the beginning of a project, exactly ask this question: what is this? What is this about? And somehow in our practice we try to rather find things than invent things. So, and I think all the three talks were about methods of how would you approach to find something, to find out what's the character of what is there already. And yeah, it has been mentioned before, this is a very different process than maybe an artist would work. So it's about finding out what is the limits and of the situation in which you are working. And I think if you have a very clear understanding of this, that should be a good starting point to think about what it could be. So the transition from what it is and what it could be.
Yes, Alan.
Yeah, I would support your last remarks because it's not a question of what it is. I mean, we can never be right or wrong about this, but it's something in between what it is and what we add. I mean, it's in the becoming, right? And that's why design is such an interesting tool, because you can start exploring that with design. So design is not the product, it's a tool to figure out what things could become. It's a tool for having this dialogue with what is there and what it could become.
I actually have another kind of follow-on question from that before I start looking into the audience for a couple of questions, which is for Ellen. It's really for Ellen and Suzanne, who really are giving us a kind of theoretical overview or armature. The questions of how to look at what's there obviously isn't a new question. I'd say it's been something which has repeatedly been raised with great concern, at least since 1972, and of course since 1452 in different ways. Can we make a case that the discussion we're having today is different to previous discussions around what is already there, and if so, what is the difference? Because there's been discussions about context, there's been discussions about understanding context on multiple levels, which could be about the social, they could be about the physical and whatever. If we're sort of saying that we're moving a discussion on. How do you think we're doing that? Or where is the crux? Is it that we're just I can't stop, but that I think is an issue for us.
I'm not sure if I can answer that, but I'll try to. I think it's a very good question. I agree. I think that it isn't a new process, but we have a responsibility to take account of our time, and we have to always rethink how we act in our time. And so the habits that what has changed and what might shift are the techniques in the media for working with. So the recourse to, I mean, that's the Fontana image is still sticking in my head because of that choreographed drawing that was made after the act. But there must have been means of communication that weren't just verbal to actually communicate, to figure things out, whether it was just inscribing in the ground and, sort of testing in prototypes and things like that. And I think these processes carry on. I think we're confronted with a huge diversity of media, particularly the digital and fast ways of picking up, recording. And we haven't actually, I think one thing that I think is very pertinent now is that we're maybe not so attuned to how we use that. We're more, we have a sort of a homogenous base level of using lots of different types of media without necessarily being expert at one. So where in the Paul Emmons images, you have the architect on site, either as divine revelation, marking where to act, or with his drawing board at it was at that point drawing board and T-square. Those were the limits of your capacity to record, to make marks. And now I think the challenge is to deal with this proliferation of media. We have iPhones, you have films, you can send things on the internet. People are using things from YouTube all the time. Are these part and parcel of what we're dealing with when we're collecting, recording? It's made it a very much messy context to have to navigate, and I think that's where a sort of navigation is important, but also the need to think about what we practice, literally do over and over again and learn to do well. So therefore you can do it with skill, with judgment, with art, is kind of pressing. And I think that comes through education, it comes through working in practices with different types of projects, communicating with clients, with the funders, etc. So for me, I think it's maybe not new question overall, but we have to deal with the media and our sort of mediating techniques.
Looking at all the images you showed us, sort of catalogizing all these ways of making notations. And as you say, I think, where do you stop and how do you know when to stop? And then I'm thinking about your comment about design as a way of finding knowledge. And do you mean the process of design? Like I have to, at an early stage, I add an idea which will help me to sift through all that overload of information. Yeah. It wasn't a question, it became an answer to your...
Susanna.
I just wanted to sort of quickly add that I suppose the in the fieldwork book, it's very much not a full catalogue in the sense that we had very selected sort of cases and pieces, so it's not a kind of manual for fieldwork. It's very eccentric in some ways, and there's a sort of emphasis to art practice and anthropology, and I suppose the direction it's heading is the kind of area of sort of more informal work of notes, sketches, the sort of roughness of work which are part of the design process when you're actually on site, when you're visiting, when you're making, when you're building the project or in the construction process. And I mean, observation that came back from anthropologists were, the sort of reaction that how on earth can you talk about fieldwork when you're talking about a very short period of time? Fieldwork is only, Margaret Mead's sort of 7 years living in one place. How can you possibly understand what's going on with these very fleeting, compressed visits or encounters? And so to turn that on its head, I think the architect has got actually some skill in dealing with compressed time and shorthand and ways of notes that connect, that deal with complexity, that deal with relations. And that's something, I suppose that's where I'm saying that we have to extend to learn how to do that with different recording techniques, and also not just visual ones, but oral, spatial, etc.
Do we have comments from anyone outside the panel? Ellen, sorry, excuse me.
No, it would be interesting with questions from the audience. I just wanted to add something to this discussion. One of my favorite cases when it comes to this complexity of representation and including time is Alexandre Chemtov's work at Ile-de-Nantes in France. He worked there for a 10-year period, and exactly what you are saying, Susanne, with this enormous complex of medias, and how to sort of create an instrument where you can communicate, where you can sort of have an overview on the one hand, and you can communicate with your client. So what he did was he made a plan guide, and he reviewed it every 3 months, and he had signs for what are we doing right now, what have we been doing, what are we intending to do, and especially the intentions turned out to shift quite radically because they learned throughout this long process of intervention in this area. But for as outstanders, it's quite impossible to sort of get access into this process. What are they after? What made them make that decision and not that one? And so the whole sort of internal logic, you need to have that information. Otherwise, it's just to sort of illustrate how complex and difficult a field we are dealing with.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do then is move the discussion on to the final speaker. I'd like to say thank you very much for this little debate. And we'll run across and introduce Alexander. So.